April 11, 1945, inside Buchenwald concentration camp, a 41-year-old American photographer stood in front of a pile of corpses and forced her hands to stop shaking. Margaret Bourke-White raised her Rolleiflex camera, adjusted the aperture ring with fingers that felt numb, and pressed the shutter. The click cut through the silence like a gunshot. She did not lower the camera. She took another frame, then another. These photographs, 37 frames shot over 4 hours, would become the first visual proof most Americans ever saw of Nazi death camps. They would be published in Life magazine, circulated to Congress, presented as evidence at Nuremberg, and force an entire generation to confront what they had refused to believe. Without these images, denial would have been easier. History might have been written differently. This is the story of the woman who made America look at what it wanted to unsee, and what it cost her to hold that camera steady. Margaret Bourke-White was the first accredited female war correspondent in United States military history. She flew combat missions over Tunisia when regulations explicitly banned women from aircraft. She documented the siege of Moscow while German artillery pounded the city. She walked into concentration camps hours after liberation and photographed scenes that made hardened soldiers vomit. She worked in a profession designed to exclude her. Editors questioned her stamina. Officers denied her access. Soldiers assumed she was a typist. But she kept showing up. She kept her shutter finger steady. And by the time the war ended, her images had reshaped how the world understood genocide, sacrifice, and the cost of freedom. But no one asked what those images did to her. Margaret was born in 1904 in the Bronx to a father who built machines and a mother who believed women should never apologize for ambition. Her father taught her to examine machinery up close, to understand how things worked by taking them apart. Her mother taught her to ignore men who said, "That's not for you." By age 26, Margaret was already making a name photographing steel mills. She climbed blast furnace catwalks, hung from factory ceilings, and shot angles that made molten metal look like liquid light. She was precise, fearless, and professionally ruthless. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, she told her editors at Life magazine she wanted to cover the war. They said women didn't go to war zones. She went anyway. Getting military credentials took 3 years of bureaucratic warfare. The War Department had no protocol for female correspondents. Officers asked why a woman wanted to see combat. They asked if her husband approved. They suggested she photograph nurses or USO shows instead. Margaret answered every question with the same flat professionalism she used in contract negotiations. She did not beg. She did not explain herself. She simply made it clear she was going to Europe, whether they credentialed her or not. In November 1942, the credentials finally came through. She was assigned to the North African Theater, where Allied forces were pushing Rommel's Afrika Korps back across Libya. She was the only woman among 200 male war correspondents. The men were waiting for her to fail. Her first week in Algiers, a colonel told her she could photograph supply depots and field kitchens. Nothing closer to the front. Margaret smiled, nodded, and the next morning hitched a ride on a truck convoy heading toward the Tunisian border. When the convoy came under Stuka dive bomber attack, she crouched behind a jeep and kept shooting frames of soldiers throwing themselves into ditches, of smoke rising from burning fuel trucks, of a medic dragging a wounded driver into cover. The photographs ran in Life 3 weeks later with the caption, "First woman photographer under fire." The colonel never spoke to her again. She wanted something bigger. She wanted to fly. In January 1943, Margaret requested permission to fly on a B-17 bombing mission over Tunis. The first 3 pilots she asked refused outright. The 4th, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, said yes, but only if she could fit into a flight suit and handle the altitude. On January 22, before dawn, she climbed into the waist gunner position of a flying fortress, strapped her cameras to her chest, and pulled on an oxygen mask. The bomber shook as it climbed. Anti-aircraft shells burst in black clouds around them. She braced herself against the fuselage, raised her speed graphic, and shot frame after frame through the open gun port, the city below, the bomb bay doors opening, the flash of explosions. Her hands were so cold she could barely feel the shutter button. When they landed 5 hours later, she stumbled out of the aircraft and threw up in the sand. But she had the pictures, and she had proven she could do what the regulations said women could not. That flight changed everything. Within weeks, Margaret was flying regular missions with bomber crews. She photographed raids over Sicily, over Naples, over the factories of northern Italy. She learned to move in bulky flight suits, to change film with frozen fingers, to frame shots while the aircraft pitched and yawed. The aircrews started calling her Maggie the Indestructible. She hated the nickname but never corrected them. In March 1943, her plane took flak over Bizerte. A shell fragment tore through the fuselage 6 inches from her head. She did not stop shooting. The photo editor at Life later told her that image, a close-up of the jagged hole with sunlight streaming through, was one of the most powerful pictures of the air war. Margaret never told anyone her hands shook for 2 days afterward. She walked through the ruins of Cassino hours after the Germans withdrew, photographing civilians who crawled through rubble looking for family members. She documented a field hospital where a surgeon operated by candlelight, his hands steady even as shells fell 100 yards away. She spent a night in a farmhouse with a company of infantry, 19-year-olds who wrote letters home they knew might never be mailed. She photographed their faces in the firelight. 3 weeks later, she learned that 12 of those soldiers had been killed in an ambush near the Gustav line. She kept the negatives in a file she never opened again. She thought she had seen the worst the war could offer. Then the Gestapo started watching her. In December 1943, Margaret was embedded with the Fifth Army in southern Italy when German intelligence identified her as a high-value target. A captured Wehrmacht officer told interrogators that Berlin had issued orders to detain any American journalist found near the front, especially women, who were considered propaganda threats. Margaret didn't know this at the time. What she did know was that a man in a dark coat had been following her for 3 days. She saw him outside her billet in Naples. She saw him again at a checkpoint near Salerno. On the 4th day, he approached her at a cafe and said in perfect English, "You take many pictures, Fräulein, perhaps too many." Then he walked away. She reported the encounter to Army intelligence. They told her to stay in secured areas. She ignored the advice. 2 weeks later, she photographed a bombed-out rail yard where locals were scavenging scrap metal. A jeep pulled up. 2 men in civilian clothes stepped out and demanded to see her credentials. She showed them. They studied the papers for a long time. One of them pointed at her camera and said, "That stays here." Margaret looked him in the eye and said, "No, it doesn't." They stared at each other. Finally, the man handed back her credentials and left. She walked back to her jeep, climbed in, and only then realized her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't turn the ignition key. That man could have arrested her. He could have confiscated every negative. He could have made her disappear. In early 1944, Margaret was reassigned to the Eastern Front. She flew to Moscow and spent 2 months documenting Soviet forces as they pushed the Germans back toward Poland. She photographed tank columns moving through snow, refugees trudging along frozen roads, artillery crews firing Katyusha rockets at dawn. One night she was in a bunker near the front when a Soviet officer showed her a map covered in red circles, German positions that were about to be overrun. He pointed to one circle and said, "We take this tomorrow. Many will die." The next morning she watched from a hilltop as Soviet infantry charged across an open field. German machine guns cut them down in waves. She raised her camera, focused, and shot the scene through tears. She didn't realize she was crying. That photograph, soldiers falling in the snow, their bodies dark against white ground, was published in Life in March 1944. 3 days later, Margaret received a letter from a woman in Ohio whose son had died on that field. The woman thanked her for showing the truth. Margaret put the letter in a drawer and never read it again. She was not sleeping. She was barely eating. But she kept working. In April 1944, one of Margaret's photographs changed the course of American policy. She had shot a series of images showing Soviet civilians, women, children, elderly men digging mass graves for German atrocities in liberated villages. The photographs were stark, unflinching, undeniable. Life ran them with the headline, "This is what we are fighting." The images circulated through Congress. Isolationist senators who had opposed Lend-Lease funding saw the pictures and reversed their positions. President Roosevelt referenced the photographs in a radio address, using them as evidence that the war against fascism was a moral necessity. Margaret never claimed credit for changing minds. But years later, a historian told her that her images had done more to solidify American support for the Soviets than any diplomatic cable. She didn't know whether to feel proud or sick. Margaret requested permission to enter the country with the first wave of troops. Her editors at Life wanted her embedded with Patton's Third Army. She wanted to be there when the camps were liberated. Rumors had been circulating for months. Stories about industrial-scale killing, about trains full of bodies, about gas chambers disguised as showers. Intelligence officers dismissed most of it as exaggeration. Margaret wasn't sure what to believe, but she knew that if the rumors were true, someone needed to photograph the evidence. Someone needed to make the world look. On April 11, 1945, the Third Army liberated Buchenwald. Margaret arrived on April 13. She stepped out of a jeep into air that smelled like rotting meat and human waste. The stench was so thick she gagged. She tied a handkerchief over her nose and walked toward the camp gates. Emaciated men in striped uniforms stood behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow, their skin stretched over bone. Some stared at her. Others looked through her as if she weren't there. An American medic approached and said, "Ma'am, you don't need to see this." She said, "Yes, I do." He led her to the crematorium. Inside, there were bodies stacked in ovens. Outside there was a pile of corpses, hundreds of them dumped like garbage. Margaret stood there for a long time. She felt her stomach twist. She felt her hands start to shake. Then she raised her Rolleiflex, adjusted the focus ring, and pressed the shutter. The camera clicked. She advanced the film. She took another shot, then another. She worked methodically, moving through the camp, photographing the barracks, the medical experimentation rooms, the piles of shoes and eyeglasses. She photographed survivors who could barely stand. She photographed the ovens. She photographed the dead. She shot 37 frames over 4 hours. She did not cry. She did not speak. She focused on the technical work, the aperture, the exposure, the composition. The camera was the only thing keeping her standing. Later she would say that taking those photographs was the hardest thing she ever did. Not because of what she saw, but because she had to make herself keep looking. Margaret's photographs from Buchenwald were published in Life magazine on May 7th. They filled 6 pages. No captions, no editorial commentary. Just the images. Americans saw them at breakfast tables, in barbershops, in waiting rooms. Senators saw them. Judges saw them. Generals saw them. The photographs were reprinted in newspapers across the country, circulated to high schools, displayed in public buildings. They became evidence at the Nuremberg Trials. They became proof. For millions of Americans, those photographs were the first time they truly understood what the Nazis had done. Margaret had done what she set out to do. She had made the invisible visible. She had forced a nation to look at what it wanted to unsee. But the cost was high. In the months after the war, Margaret tried to return to normal life. She took assignments in India, in South Africa, in Korea. She photographed Gandhi, documented apartheid, covered the partition of Pakistan. But no matter where she went, she carried Buchenwald with her. She had nightmares, vivid recurring dreams in which she was back at the camp, standing among the corpses, unable to leave. She woke up at 3 in the morning, her heart pounding, her sheets soaked with sweat. She could not talk about it. When colleagues asked about Buchenwald, she changed the subject. When friends pressed her, she said, "I did my job. That's all." She buried herself in work. She traveled constantly. She never stayed in one place long enough to think. In 1952, Margaret noticed a tremor in her left hand. By 1956, she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. The tremors made it increasingly difficult to hold a camera steady. She tried medication. She tried experimental surgery. She kept working as long as she could, but eventually the disease made it impossible. She retired in 1957. She spent her final years in a house in Connecticut, surrounded by prints of her photographs but unable to take new ones. The tremors worsened. Her speech slowed. She could no longer hold a pen or a camera. On August 27, 1971, she died at age 67. Her obituaries praised her pioneering work as a photojournalist, her courage under fire, her groundbreaking images from World War II. But they said little about the cost. They said little about what it meant to look directly at horror and make others look too. Margaret Bourke-White was the first American woman to fly on combat missions, the first to enter liberated Nazi camps, the first to publish photographs that forced a nation to confront genocide. Her work established a new standard for photojournalism, one that required not just technical skill but moral courage, the willingness to see what others could not, and to share it without flinching. But history has a way of remembering the images and forgetting the person who took them. Her name appears in photo credits and footnotes, but the full story, what she endured, what she sacrificed, what she carried, is rarely told. She is remembered as a photographer, not as a woman who paid for those images with sleepless nights, trembling hands, and a lifetime of bearing witness. How many people have looked at her photographs from Buchenwald without knowing she could never stop seeing them herself?